Well, welcome everyone. I am so happy to be here today for the dialogue with the authors. Today is November 10th, 2021, and I'm happy to be here with Lorraine Hedtke, the author of Bereavement Support Groups, Breathing Life into Stories of the Dead. And just a few words about the Taos Institute. We are a nonprofit educational organization. We are completely virtual, and we promote social constructionist theory and practices across fields and disciplines like education, healthcare, organizational development, community development, peace building, and so much more. We believe that it is through the relational processes that we create our future, and conversations like we're having today are really making an impact in the world. And we do promote these ideas through workshops, courses, conferences, online and offline offerings. We have a publication house. We have many resources from dissertations, podcasts, videos, lots of resources for everyone to explore on our website. And today we're here with Lorraine, as I said, and Lorraine teaches about death and dying and bereavement throughout the world. Her unique ideas and practices are drawn from narrative therapy and represent a departure from the conventional models of grief psychology. So her articles have appeared in numerous professional journals and magazines. With John Winslade, she has co-authored Remembering Lives, Conversations with the Dying and the Bereaved, published in 2004. Her children's book, My Grandmother is Always With Me, published in 2005, is written with her daughter, Addie. And for more information about her work, in addition to the book that we are talking about today, you can visit her website at www.rememberingpractices.com. So Lorraine, welcome, and you can take it from here.
Thanks. Thank you, Alex. That was lovely. And welcome everyone in various time zones. And I see various places from geographically around the world, and it is really lovely to be with people. Some of you I've met before in other contexts, and so it's nice to see you again. And there's also some new faces here, so I'm looking forward to hearing your voices as we talk today. It's funny, yes, to think about how I think that bio might be a little bit old to say that I teach all around the world, because right now I teach from my kitchen, where I have been for the last almost 2 years, right? That as all of us have. So I teach from my home in Southern California, and speak about these ideas I feel really passionate about. And the ideas I'm going to talk a little bit about with you this morning are ideas that have informed my career for the last 25 years, both from all the time when I was working in hospices, both as a frontline medical social worker, to working into administrative and supervisory roles in hospices, that these ideas have developed in how I want to sit with people. And part, just a personal note, part of the ways in which those ideas came into my life, and the ways in which I started thinking about the ideas was back when I was first starting in my career. And I would sit with people whose loved ones had died, and they were in places of just phenomenal pain, the yearning and the desperation that grief can bring. That to me, it always felt cruel to say, look, that relationship is done. We need to find a place where we can kind of tuck it away and be complete with it. And it sat uneasy with me. And so at the same time I was doing that, I was also doing a postgraduate study through the Institute for Creative Change in Phoenix, Arizona, with Sharon and Bob Cotter, and we were exploring ideas that were based in social constructionism, that we were just starting, we were at the precipice of starting to call the ideas social constructionism. At the time, we were really being informed by Derrida's work and looking at deconstructionism. And we hadn't yet even been introduced to narrative as a way of thinking. And so these burgeoning ideas kind of started coalescing in my work in grief, and my work in understanding kind of how good counseling conversations take place, right? That intertwine the beauty of story, right? The beauty of what happens when we capture a love story, right? And not just notice it historically, but celebrate it and sew it into the fabric of the future, right? So my work, that has been the entirety of my work, of looking at how we do that, to honor people who are no longer living. How do we carry them with us in ways that fill our hearts, right? And give us a place to really move forward, right? When we have that experience, that grief brings us to our knees, that I want to turn to those relational holdings and connections that we have with people who have died to inform us about where we're going to go next. Right? So I want to talk a little bit about how I do that. And to do that, really, I want to talk about the thinking to start with, the thinking that informs the way in which I create questions, whether I'm sitting with people who are experiencing the death of a loved one that is very recent or older, whether the relationship was a relationship filled with love and joy, or whether the relationship was more complicated and complex, right? So I want to speak about the thinking that trans versus both the conversations I have with individuals, as well as when I'm sitting and doing bereavement support groups. The nice thing about the book, the book that we're talking, one of the books that we're talking about here, the bereavement support group book, this was a project that took me into my doctorate with the Taos Institute, that I will forever be grateful that I got to do my doctorate with the Taos people, because it allowed me that space to do the research into something that I was already really excited and really passionate about. I worked with Ken during that time, and he guided me and so believed in these ideas. It was refreshing because there was so much, particularly back. This was like I finished the PhD in 2010, and there was so much pushback against kind of these ideas of looking at how grief could be a socially constructed experience, right? And there still is, right? There still is pushback on that. And so I am grateful that I found a home with Taos where I could speak about and develop these ideas in a different venue. So let me talk a little bit about the pushback, because as I move into talking about the kind of the new ways of thinking, I want us to be really clear that our ears are hearing the distinction between kind of conventional ideas and a social construction or crafted or storied idea about grief, right? And just in terms of context, I want to talk with you maybe for 20, 30 minutes while my coffee is still warm, and then I want to engage in dialogue with you. And also, if we want, we can engage in smaller conversations with in breakout rooms. But so that's my thinking. Is I'll talk a little bit about kind of the format and the structure, and then we'll engage in dialogue. So, and feel free to put questions in the chat too. I'm really happy to respond to that. So, kind of. Let me speak about the genealogy of grief psychology for just a minute, right? Because there's been a strong dominant model that I want us to be alert to as we're thinking about these new ideas and new ways of moving forward, right? That the dominant model has been dominant, right? It has been the preferred way of thinking about grief. It has been the model born out of Freudian psychology more than 100 years ago, that has been repurposed and recapitulated and become dogma in many circles, right? Now, there has been challenges to that. This group is representative of that, but it has, those threads of the challenges to the dominant model have been smaller, definitely. The dominant model of grief psychology that permeates throughout the world, right? And not just Western countries, but throughout the world, right? Everywhere I have been, when I teach, that model that believes that the proper and correct way to do grief when somebody dies is to have a series of processes that end you in the completion of the relationship, right? That has been the dominant experience that people have lived with, right? That is supported in many, many circles. And again, there's smaller threads that we'll speak about that challenge that, right? But there has been the belief and the insistence and the prescription, right, that says when your loved one dies, when the person that you are hanging out with, whether you love them or not, when they die, that there should be a intersection of completion between the physical reality and the emotional reality, right? So when that person's body is no longer here, when they take their last breath, that model has suggested, and at times even more than suggested, has insisted that you have these experiences where the relationship is done, right? It is true whether we're looking at the 5 stages with Kubler-Ross, that talks about where you end up is in a place of acceptance, right? Which assumes then that the relationship is complete, right? Or whether we're looking at models like William Worden's work that supports the belief that when a person is grieving, that there's 4 tasks that they need to go through to have a sense of done, right? To dislocate yourself from the relationship, right? It's true in Bowlby's work around attachment that we attach, or according to Freud, we decathexize, if we want to get really crazy and use really crazy Western psychological terms, right? Where we remove our attachment to the person, right? All of these are individual models, right? They're not relational models, right? It's not about you and the dead person. It's about you detaching from the dead person, right? And these models are intensely sophisticated, right? In their reductionistic approach, right? That they want you to do particular stages and tasks to before a person dies, they handle what they think is an anticipatory grief, as if that will make it better for when the person dies, right? Then that continues after the person dies, again, with the assumptions that we're cutting the ties that bind, according to grief psychology, right? This model has been the model that people who are consulting with us come to speak to us about, right? Is a model when they come in and say, I have not been able to get over the death of my loved one, or I'm in denial about it, right? Or I'm only in stage 2 and I'm getting stuck there. Can you please help me get past that so I can move through the stages, right? Those assumptions are informed by discourses that are operating in the background of Western grief psychology, again, that permeates, right? It is in the air we breathe and the water that we drink. The part that I find important in there, in terms of working with the people that consult with us, is what they're saying is, I am in pain and I want something different, right? Where my ideas start to depart from that is that the belief that I hold is that the way in which we support and find relief for the pain that grief brings is not in the disconnection. Grief psychology got that wrong, right? It is in finding a way to reconnect in a story form with a person who has died, right? To find the places where the love story can continue, to find places where we can make sense out of the relationship, right? So I would go as far as saying that grief psychology, the dominant grief model, right, produces iatrogenic pain, right? And what I mean by that is that in the supporting of the dislocation of the relationship, in the supporting of letting go, in the supporting of acceptance, in creating terminology about moving on and closure and all that junk, right, that we actually produce more pain. We cut people off from resource, right? So the little girl who's 14 years old, whose mother has just died, who's telling me about how she is craving a sense of her mom, right? And she's missing her mom so desperately. If I sit with her and I say, look, your mom has died, so we need to put your mom in a chair in front of us and say whatever it is that you didn't get to say to her, to have a sense of completion and closure so this pain won't hurt you. I am actually producing injury to her, is my belief, okay? And instead of saying, let's find a way for your mother to live with you. Let's find a way for your mother's love to guide your every step, right? Right. So the dominant model, and I'll shift from this in a minute. I could rail against this for days, but we'll never get onto some of the good goo. My belief is that it actually creates more pain, right? It produces a sense of yearning to say, where is that person, right? That I crave so much. And we're being told in that model, let go, forget, move on, have closure, let go of their items, right? And then that's met with a sense of silence. We don't talk about the dead, right? Because we're afraid it will hurt or create pain, right? So bereaved people are in this horrible place where they've been brought to their knees, where the loss is suffocatingly, oppressively painful. And then we say, okay, now we're going to make it worse for you, all right? COVID has not helped, right? That we have people who are living with grief and have not had opportunities to share. Grief is meant to be shared and held in community. And COVID has put this overlay on top of it that we are left with these individual experiences where you can't have a funeral, you can't sit with the person as they're dying, right? And it creates these places of tremendous pain, right? All right. So if that is the belief of Western psychology, right, I think we can do better. I think we can do tons and tons better in serving the people who consult with us, whether we're talking about individual experiences of grief or whether we're talking about the experience of doing it in the context of groups. Groups are great fun to do it with grief because it gives you an immediate sense of witness and audience. I'll talk a little bit about that. That's also true, just talking about individual conversations as well. I love doing bereavement groups because it creates these places, right? Where we have that experience of witness to create a new context for the loved ones to live, right? So let me speak a little bit about the assumptions that I work with that inform the way in which I create questions and the way in which I create ritual in the grief groups. And then I'll talk really specifically about some of the ways in which I do that. So I'm just looking at a couple of the comments here. Yeah. Nice. Thank you, Jesse, for these. For those references, really helpful, right? There's places. I'll come back to that in a minute. Let me go back to some of the assumptions, because otherwise I'll go off on in a sidebar tangent that will get me stuck for 20 minutes. So some of the assumptions that inform the way in which I work, right? Obviously, I'm working from a socially constructed postmodern idea about grief that believes that we live in relational space, right? That our identities get connected and formed and developed and crafted and reformed relationally, right? That in itself is a pretty radical departure from psychology, right? That thinks that we are formed individually through developmental psychology. So from the belief that we are relational beings, that our identities are formed relationally, that the assumptions then that I make is that those stories, those identities do not die when the person dies, right? Love does not die when the person dies, right? It changes, obviously, right? That when a person dies, that we have to find different ways to connect, but the stories do not die, the love does not die. That one of the many things then that informs my work is thinking about where will those stories continue to have a home, right? Where can the relationship continue to have a home? How do we develop that relationship? And how do we develop it in ways that will affirm the best of the past to create a future, right? Now that would also be in the, this is all the comforts of Zoom, that my dog is going to bark for us. That this includes the places where we have complicated relationships, right? That I'm looking at how is it that we create a new relationship, right? Hold on one second. I'm going to tell my dog to be quiet. Hold on. She's hearing noises outside, and so she's just wanting to chime in about the importance of relational experiences, right? So our stories outlive our physical reality, right? Which is an idea that I find really comforting. Our physical reality is fragile, short-term, right? And kind of the big picture of life, right? And when we die, I personally want to continue to have my stories accessible to the people who love me, right? And who I love, right? If I know that stories and love can transcend death, right? That we can continue to access those stories, right? That we can continue to have those places where the stories can become a resource, right? For the bereaved, right? So let's go back to that 14-year-old girl, right? I can be asking her stories about how her mom continues to be a part of her life, right? She told me about, I'm thinking of one girl in particular who I sat with, and she told me that before her mom died, that her mom was a runner, and and before she got sick, that her mom was teaching her about, what it kind of the art of jogging, right? And so when her mom died, one of the things that this little one did was she started wearing her mom's running shoes, right? Now they were a little bit big for her, so they were kind of noticeable, right? But for her, that she found this place where I'd ask her about what was it like for her, what did it feel like to have her feet in the shoes that her mom had touched, that her mom's feet saw the world with, and when she would run, right? What is it like to have her mom's shoes guiding her steps, right? What is it like to grow into those shoes, right? So those stories become places, that touchstones, where we can weave her mom's life into hers. We can speak about her mom's vision for her daughter, right? And the daughter can become the ventriloquist for those stories, right? As a way to ameliorate places of grief, right? Maybe not rid the grief, but to find places that will lessen and point a way forward, where this little one does not need to move on, does not need to let go, but can take steps where her mom is with her, right? Everyone has access to that, right? if we believe that the love does not die when a person dies, that we can continue to have access to those stories. We can continue to not only have access to those stories historically, right, but that we can then actually use those stories to inform us about moving forward. We can take them with us, the stories of the dead, their love, their belief in us can be affirmed to create something new, right? Can be affirmed to create new purpose, new meaning, right? And new experiences. So for even if you have a very short time with a person while they were living, those threads of love can be folded into an experience to create something new. It can create new identities for the living. It can create resource. It can create a place where we can speak about the beauty of the relationship. Right. All right. So how is it, and what is it that I would find interesting in how I would do that? Let me talk a little bit about some nuts and bolts. Right. Actually, you know what? Let me wait for a second. Before I talk about nuts and bolts, let's talk amongst ourselves for a minute, and then I'll talk about some nuts and bolts. I'm wondering about, let me ask everybody a question. I'm wondering about what ideas and what I'm speaking about are resonating with you. What places are you finding useful? You know, where are there places that feel clunky to you? So maybe feel free to unmic yourself and let me hear your voices. I'd really love that right now. And then I'll talk about some specifics. What's bubbling up?
You're speaking to the choir, to me, Lorraine.
Yeah. Well, I'd like you to be the Greek choir for a minute, Michael. To speak about, I've been listening to lately the Theater of War productions, which are amazing. If you don't know the Theater of War, the people who do these amazing Greek plays, right? The tragedies of the Greek plays, and bring them into modern day context, right? And so the Greek choir, right? Like the people who provide, you know, the conscience, the moral arbiters to point the way. So feel free.
I actually, when I was doing my bachelor's work in social work, I was, and that was in the early 90s, I was placed, as you know, in social work, you don't get to pick your field placements, and they put me in a agency, community families service agency, and their HIV/AIDS program, and we were doing a lot of grief work there. At the time, I hadn't taken an advanced course in grief work, which I did later when I was finishing up my MSW, and I was introduced to the book Continuing Bonds. But so we were basically using Teresa Rando's stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, the Continuing Bonds, I also was using a lot of random stuff back then. And the Continuing Bond stuff is really interesting, right? To look at the evolution of it. I have some concerns about what's happened to it. Not about the idea of Continuing Bonds, and the two Continuing Bonds books are incredibly helpful. The one that came out in, I want to say 96, the edited text, and it's just called Continuing Bonds. And then the later one that was like around the 2016, 2017, somewhere around there.
Yes, you're in that one.
Yeah, I am. Yeah, you would think I would know the date, but yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah,
I couldn't tell you the date either.
Yeah, and I have some concerns about what's happened to some of the ideas around Continuing Bonds, is because it has been running through a sieve of quantification, right? that rather than just seeing continuing bonds as something that's magical, that produces this beautiful alchemy and relationship, that there's been all these scales have been created about how much bond you are allowed to have is healthy and not healthy. And so I have some concerns about kind of how modernism is usurping some of that. So anyway, so I see a couple of people also. Can I start with Julie and come to McKenna? Would that be okay? Julie, you were wanting to speak.
Yeah, I had more of a question. I find the difference that this has made to my work as I go in to situations where someone has experienced a loss with the idea that there's nothing to fix here. And that keeps me really comfortable with the fact that this is just love. I'm just in the presence of love. But one of the growth edge that I find I experience a lot is like when I watch you work and I watch Helene work, I feel this like artfulness and this, you hang out and question more successfully, where I sometimes feel pulled to speak about the ideas and to like name dominant discourses of grief when I'm with clients. Can you talk a little bit about how you do or don't sort of visualize those discourses? And if you don't, what do you do instead? Like, what are the questions that replace that?
Wow. Well, I think I'll get more into this in a few minutes when we start talking about kind of the nuts and bolts, but I love what you just said about that you're in the presence of love. And that what you're doing is you hang with love. And I think that actually is what guides me, right? That is the visibility that becomes the most important, right? Is how is it that we seek those stories of love to bring them forward. And that's the visibilization that I need, right? I'll come back. I'm going to hang with your question for a few minutes, Julie. I'll come back to it again when we're talking about how do we do this. Is that okay? But yeah, I think being kind of a love-seeking entity as we sit with people will always come back to guiding us on where we need to go and what needs to get visibilized. And I'll talk a little bit about kind of the construction of that in a minute. Yeah, McKenna, please.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, I'm doing some work with elderly families. Just kind of fell into this in my life. And you asked what was clunky. And I think a piece of clunkiness is complicated relationships. And, and is there still something to learn? Is there still something to glean from that? Or should we, really focus on the positive aspects? That's something I'm kind of struggling with a little bit.
Yeah. Complicated relationships are clunky in the best of worlds, right? Right. And grief is like, clunky and complex, right? A couple of things I want to say about that. And again, I'll come back a little bit on the nuts and bolts pieces, but just briefly is I don't want what the ways in which I'm thinking to be thought of it as kind of a positive psychology approach, right? That kind of like doesn't sit well with me. And when I've heard kind of the remembering piece as like the sixth stage, right? So you go through this whole process of letting go, and then people say, and now you get to remember, right? That also doesn't sit well with me, but I think with complex relationships, I'm not wanting to highlight those places of positive as the only story. I want to hold the complexity of relationship, right? I want to both honor that and talk about which pieces of that relationship now do you want to edit in to hold closer, and perhaps which pieces do you want to edit out and have further away from you, and to hold that complexity in life as in death, right? actually in death as in life, right? There's a woman I was talking to who talked about her husband died unexpectedly when she was pregnant with her their first child, and he died from a drug overdose, and she didn't know that he was using drugs, right? And when I was talking to her, she talked about how one day that she was really, really tired, that she spent, at that point, her baby had been born, their baby, that she was tired. She'd been up with their little girl all night, and she was saying that she was just exhausted. And I said, and that she was really missing her husband, right? And I was asking her, so like, if her husband was alive, what would he have done? Like, how would he have supported her during the night? Would he have, what would that have been like? And she said, are you kidding? He would have slept through the night, and I would have been mad at him just the same. And so I'm mad at him now that he's not here, and I'm mad at him because he was a jerk, and to hold those places and honor that complexity, that she also had a thread of love that ran through that, and a thread of knowing that those pieces were also part of that, right? That is different from when I get into speaking with people where relationships where there was a lot of abuse, right? That's a very different topic, and I'm using really different questions. And again, I'll swing back around in a few minutes when I talk about that and just touch on that. But that, and again, we could talk all day about that, right? Because that is super complicated. Where am I going next? I see a few other hands here. Am I saying this right? Swarnima.
Swarnima, yeah. Hi.
Hi, please.
So what I was really drawn to, I think, in your work was, again, the idea of continuing bonds. Because in India, there are a lot of cultural ways of looking at death and ancestors and relationships. Ideas like love never dies, or if you get married, it's for 7 lifetimes, or, honoring the dead annually through ceremonies. I think the idea of continuing bonds sits really well, where psychotherapy and what's already present in culture fit well together rather than becoming pathologized.
Yeah.
The other thing I think I really appreciate was how the sense of self or identity, which all of us experience differently in different relationships, can also be brought alive again when you see yourself through the eyes of somebody who's passed. These 2 ideas, I think, really added to my practice. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for the really important reminder that these the ways in which that we're speaking about right now are grounded in the cultural stories that we bring, right? And all of us, right, have these resources to draw upon. Where the places that there's been kind of a cultural clash has been in those places where the discourses of westernized knowledge or westernized medicine and psychology has been an overlay to say, no, you're not doing it correctly, right? And so that it pushes cultural experiences to the margins, right? And silences the stories of the dead, right? Silences those voices, and sees the cultural resources as kind of quaint practice, right? As opposed to, it's actually comforting, and it's the way we do it, and it's the way we've always done it, and it's the way we want to continue to do it, right? We'd be so better off without some of the modern psychological ideas, right? That do that, yeah. Renee, I see you have a comment here about David Kessler talking about the 6 stages as finding meaning, right? Thanks. Exactly, right. I could rail against that for a little while, right? Okay, like just skip the previous 5 stages, right? And go straight to the 6th stage, and it's so much better. Yeah, Glenn, please. You've been patiently waiting.
How are you doing?
Good.
Yeah, I really enjoyed reading your book, and I'm the reason why I've joined today is because I'm interested in working with family groups. That's my trade, and I've got a family in mind, but I won't go into the depths of it. But one of the things that seemed to influence silence in this family are many traditions and sort of dominant discourses that kind of emerge through strong religious belief. Also, beliefs of fear that when talking about something so painful, people actually, and they've experienced it, run away from them. And what seems to have emerged over many years, and this touches with what two of the other audience members have spoken about before, about complex relationships and the importance of honoring complexity. The idea of patterns of silence have seemed to have really been instilled in this family, whereby the death of one of the members hasn't been able to be spoken about for many, many years. And I'm just curious what thoughts emerge for you, and also the idea of kind of applying some of your ideas, and for instance the one of deconstructing language and how we've got to where we've got to, you know. I won't say any more because I think I've laid down some context of what I'm interested in.
Yeah. Thanks. I really appreciate that, Glenn, to speak about these places. They're so painful, right? So a lot of times, right, that the stories that people bring to us, they're heartbreaking, right? And not just the context, the relational context of the life and the death, but the ways in which discourse has produced such a narrow path forward, right? So let me talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts, and I'll make sure that I specifically speak to the things that you just said, Glenn, as well as the other questions, right? About how do I move forward with that, right? Where I start, this is true whether I'm talking about working with a family or an individual or a support group. I always start in the same place when I'm having a conversation about somebody who's died, and that is with introduction, right? I want to have a conversation to bring the person who has died or people who have died into view, right? And so I'm going to be asking all kinds of very gentle questions about them, right? Who were they, right? What kinds of things did they love? What did you call them? What did they call you? What did they teach you? What did you teach them? Those are questions of introduction, right? When I'm working with people where there is a lot of silencing, right? That those questions might need to be very gentle, very slow, right? Where we take our time in developing that sense, right? I may ask them to bring me a picture of the person who's died, right? Oftentimes they just show me right on their phone. And then I'll ask, 100 questions about the picture, right? Where was the picture taken? Tell me about the look that's on their face at that moment, right? Tell me about what they might have been thinking at that moment, right? So that we can create whatever ways that we can create a sense of knowing who that person was, right? Those questions are often past tense questions. It's one of the few places where I use past tense, right? Because for obvious reasons that when I'm saying, what kind of work did they do? Those are past tense questions, right? Now, one of the reasons why I start with introduction, it gets a little bit towards Julie, towards your question about the visibilization, right, of the operating the background discourses. So I start with introduction that it visibilizes the dead, and the dead have been so silenced, so that their stories, the love, the experience, the relational context, right, gets buried with them when they die, right? And so the introduction gives me that place to bring them to life, right? To bring the opportunities of story, bring the opportunities of love visible. And the other reason why I start with introduction, and McKenna, this will go back to those places of complicated relationship, right? Is that if the relationship is complex, I'm going to start hearing about it right then, right? And I'm going to be able to gauge the level of complexity, not in any kind of measurement way, right? But if somebody says right up front, they were a real shit, right? Or I hadn't talked to them for 10 years, right? Because of, XYZ reason, right? That would not be the appropriate time for me to say, tell me what you love most about them. Okay? Because that would dismiss all of that complexity and it would create more injury to them, right? So I need to be speaking about those places of where does the complexity live, right? So I always start with that introduction because it helps to bring the context of the relationship, right? Now, the other reason why I do this, and I really spend a lot of time, sometimes I might do this for over a course of a few sessions. If I'm doing a bereavement support group or a family group, this is going to take more than one conversation, right? In a support group, if I have 6-8 people, to really give everybody a sense of time and their due to honor the person who's died, we may do this over a period of 2 or 3 sessions, right, of introduction, of really putting flesh to the bones, right, of who this person was, right? How do they show up in your life, right? The other reason why I start with introduction that is really important to me is that it starts with, for me, the background construction of relationship, right? Who this person was while they were alive. Most often in modern grief psychology, in bereavement support groups, and in grief counseling, we've been trained to believe to start with the story of the death, right? That becomes the moment of pin drop, right? Tell me what happened when they died. How did they die? What did they die from, right? That is historically what gets told in the groups. People come to groups thinking that that's where they're going to have to start, that they're going to tell the story of the death, right? I don't understand why we do that, right? It is because when we truncate the relationship to that place, right, we lose all that amazing other gooey, fantastic parts of human life, right? So why don't we start with the life, right? Tell me about them. Tell me the things that brought them to life, right? Tell me what you love about them. Again, I'm not going down the path of a relationship that's painful. So I want to put in context and put into view those places where the relationship lives, right? Where it did live, where it can live, and that will then create the foundation for what's to become, right? I firmly believe that we are always in the process of becoming, right? That's true in life, that's true right now, right? That our identities are always in the process of being formed and shaped. But it also is true that we continue to become after we die, right? We continue to have places of purpose and meaning where we become more than, right, in death, right? If the way in which the person died was traumatic, people will tell me about that in the introduction, right? I don't ask when I'm talking about introductions. I don't start with, tell me how your loved one died, right? But if it was important, for example, when somebody dies by their own hand, or in circumstances that are perhaps unusual, and how we think of death, that becomes known quite quickly in the introduction, right? So that I can pay attention to that. But I don't want to reify the way in which the person died at the expense of the context of the relationship, right? So I always start there. I always start with introduction. I make visible the love, right? I make visible the places where relationship can start to grow. Now, Glenn, I want to go back to what you were saying about what do we do with kind of those discourses that oppress, right? because there's so many places where the dead get silenced. Again, whether I'm doing bereavement support groups or individual counseling, that oftentimes what I do after the introduction, right, is I'm going to be asking questions about the discourses that are informing the way in which a person thinks, right? I want to make visible those discourses that both produce helpful stories as well as not helpful stories. So I'll be asking the very simple question of, what were you told about how you should think, how you should act, how you should feel since your loved one died, right? What have you read? What have you seen? What do you believe about how you should be acting right now? About how you should be thinking about your loved one, right? How you should be feeling about it, right? And to help flush out some of those ideas, right? Now, that's the first part of that. The second part is I ask people to critique that, right? By saying, are those ideas useful or are they not useful, right? What in those ideas do you find supportive, loving, helpful, right? What in those ideas do you find challenging that you would like to refute? Okay. My belief about this is that it allows people to place themselves in a way to critique the practices of discourse, to critique the experiences that have been supportive and silencing. Right? And again, this might, if I'm in a group, this might take several conversations, right? Where we are speaking to the experiences that have produced the experiences, right? Flushing those things forward. All right. Okay. All right, so those will be kind of the starting intro places for me, right? Before we even get into the building of the relationship, before we get into those places where we can lay the craft of developing relationship, right? That those two pieces, introduction, unpacking discourse, feel like kind of the precursor, right? That lays the foundation of the house that is yet to be built, which becomes those relational places. All right, let me pause again. How are we doing? How's life going? How's death going? Good. All right. Talk to me. Things are bubbling up, right?
I really appreciated how you phrased that, like making a discourse visible by asking those questions, like, what were you told about how you should act and feel in a time of grief?
Mm-hmm.
I guess what's bubbling up is how useful this feels. Like, it feels really useful and practical with many of my current therapeutic situations. Like, it just feels really useful and helpful.
Good. Yeah. Yeah. Good. Yeah. Some of this feels to me like common sense, right? Yeah. Right. And then psychology takes away our common sense, right? Yeah. Religion does, medicine does. Yeah. Yeah.
Some of it feels like what you would be doing if you didn't have those other narratives of dominant discourses telling you that you shouldn't be feeling this way.
Right. Yeah, I think so too. Yeah. John, can I ask you something here? You have a comment in the chat early from a few minutes back about the Lois Tonkin model. Can I ask you about that? Because I don't know that model.
From my understanding, that's a model where your grief and yourself appear to be the same size, that they're represented as two circumferences on a piece of paper. Mm-hmm. And so at the immediate time of the onset of grief, it appears to be as big as you are conceptually. And the traditional teaching is that you progress forward and the grief diminishes. So the picture shows 3 or 4 steps, that the grief circle getting smaller and smaller and smaller relative to yourself. But apparently, this is what I learned this all last year and continue to like, and it seems so much of an overlap here. The answer actually, according to her, to this model, is that the grief stays the same size, and what should happen is that you yourself enlarge, and as so diagrammatically your circle begins to enlarge relative to the grief, such that you can then encompass the grief, and you can carry that grief forward with you. And I see some very interesting overlaps with what you've been talking about. I really enjoyed this webinar. I'm only 1 year into post-retirement bereavement support, not even counseling, but it's a very exciting, challenging and satisfying area. But this particular model is one I was attracted to, and I see the person growing, enlarging, being able to take forward. I firmly believe with a lot of what you've said about you never forget. You mustn't forget. You've got to go forward. It's how you go forward, and continuing bonds is one way, and so on and so on. So that's the what I understand to be the Lois Tonkin model.
Yeah. Well, now, thank you for sharing that, John. I'm curious now. I'm going to have to look this up. I don't know her model, and it sounds as if it'd be really good for people who are visual.
Yeah.
But what I'm thinking about is like I'm always thinking relationally, like, where does the relationship live in that, right? So yes, the grief, it becomes an entity that we can externalize using narrative language to speak about its effect on us and how we carry it with us. To me, that makes a lot of sense. And I would want to put the relationship with the deceased right in the middle of that circle as well. So I'm not just carrying my relationship to grief, which I am, but I'm also carrying my relationship.
Sounds good. Yeah.
So I'm going to add an extra circle.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm going to add 20 extra circles by the time I'm done, I'm sure, because I'm going to add then all the people who are going to help me carry the weight of the grief in that model as well, and put them in my circles. So basically, I'm going to become a bubble person.
But that could be summarized by the model of yourself enlarging and growing, and you can incorporate all those concepts into that that part of the model, so that you then can surround and carry that so-called grief, the memory, however you want to end up with carrying it forward, and not ever assuming that you're going to forget it, not ever assuming that you can, quotes, get over it. You just learn to. It's a bit like COVID, isn't it? We're just learning to live with it. Sorry, it's a bad analogy, really, but
not really. It's actually a very fitting, apt analogy. Thanks. Yeah. Thanks so much, and I'm glad you're exploring these ideas in retirement, which is a funny idea.
Yeah, especially as a doctor. Yeah.
Right. You get to go into these new places. Very cool. All right, Glenn, and then to Julie, please.
I was just I was thinking and wanting to add to what I forgot the chap's name before. Just mentioned this, Lewis. John. I was thinking about the word. I really like the phrase that Michael White used and you used in your book about double listening, if I'm quoting you correctly. And the idea here, I think, that interests me is the listening to the relationship someone has with grief, and listening to the relationship that the person has with the person that died. They kind of are two different things and similar. And I think that kind of connected with what you were saying. And that idea of double listening, I thought was quite useful. It's kind of listening to the process and the content at the same time.
Exactly. Yeah. And for me, it also is listening for the stories of loss or testimony to stories of love. Right. So, I'm always listening for what's the other side of the coin, So, the stories of pain are the stories of yearning for connection, right? And how do I bring forward the latter, the yearning of connection, right? Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Yeah, Julie, please.
One of the things that sometimes trips me up is the word grief. Because I sometimes think we move around as though we all have a shared definition of this word. And it sometimes seems like a word to me that is invisibly holding the assumptions of like dominant psychological discourse. Like I think when people use the word grief, they sometimes mean the process model, like the task model, these kinds of things. And I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit about what it means to you, that like the word grief or the idea of grief, because I think I continue to just think it means love. But I just wondered if you could speak to that a little.
Yeah, it's interesting thought. Yeah, I think there's been all kinds of dissections about the word grief and being bereaved, and I think they have been taken up by that kind of modernist idea, right? Particularly the idea of grief. That has been kind of universalized to these experiences of tasking, right? And also has been coupled with the word work, right? That's been bought into by capitalism, right? And Freud actually gave birth to that conjoined twin experience of grief as work, right? Which is an interesting and painful way, I think, of thinking of grief, as opposed to thinking about kinds of labor of love, right? Of how do we hold the stories of for our loved ones? How do we, what do we owe to our loved ones to bring love forward, right? What is it that we can feel enlivened by the telling of their stories, by finding love, right? I think grief has become also synonymous with loss, which is really unfortunate, right? Like, so people will come kicking and screaming into conversations in bereavement support groups or in grief counseling, thinking that, that we're going to be telling the stories of everything that is lost and the pain connected to that. So I think we might need a new word and how we speak about it, because it for me, it's about the restoration of love, right? It's about when I think about I'm a huge fan of Tom Attuck's work, and he speaks about these beautiful metaphors of how do we find the love story to continue, right? Where do we find the places where we feel their love for us, and in exchange, we love them. And that is what carries us through, right? It's not necessarily the stories of loss, although there is loss. And again, I'm not wanting to overlook that or only speak about the positive, but how is it that that has become so dominant, that grief has been thought of as sad loss trauma, right? As opposed to thinking about what needs to be restored, what needs to be reclaimed, right? And how do we go about doing that, right? How do we take those steps to really underscore relationship, right? Let me actually talk about, we have a few minutes. Let me just add in a couple of things that I like to do in my conversations, both individually and in the groups. Because I talked a little bit about, starting with introductions to give us that foundation. And I talked a little bit about, how do we unpack discourse? And one of the things then that from those places where I want to grow with people is I want to talk about intentionally about how the person who has died will continue to travel with us, right? And so I want to be asking a lot. And again, this might take us a couple of meetings if we're in a bereavement group. And certainly if I'm doing individual counseling, this may take us many conversations, right? Where we're talking about the many ways in which the loved one is going to travel with us. And so I'm going to be really curious about that. I'm going to be asking questions about the ways in which the person who died responded to life's challenges, right? And how we can borrow on that, right? How we can create places where we can bring the best of the person who died, of their strengths and their skills and their knowledges forward to say, how can that inform me now, right? How can that create a place for the person living with grief to find that as a place of comfort, as a place of resource, right? I will ask questions about using kind of subjunctive verb tenses to bring the dead person's voice into the room, right? Since the dead person can't actually speak, I have to speak in traffic and in the world of possibility, to use Bruner's work, right? That I have to speak about, what might your loved one say, using that subjunctive might, right? If they were here, and how they would want to guide you, right? How might they advise you, right? What would they hope for you, right? Now, that's half of the equation for me, is that using those kind of subjunctive questions that exist in kind of a virtual world of possibility. And then I want to actualize those words, those questions, to speak about if that would be the questions of, if you were to follow their advice, what might happen, right? So speaking about it in terms of kind of the ethers of, calling them from, the dead person from wherever they may be, to say, give us some advice here, give us some guidance, right? You get to channel them because you know them really well. You know them better than anybody else in this conversation, right? And so what are they going to say on how you are going to live with grief, how are you going to find them, where you're going to find a sense of their stories, okay? And then what happens when you do, right? What's the effect of that experience, right? So it is the world of possibility brought into the world of the actual, okay? And I don't stop there, of course, because there's an additional piece that I want to add to that, is who is going to help you get there? So going back to John, to this model, is who else are we going to put in those bubbles, right? So that you get to carry those stories with you. Who is going to support them? Who is going to reinforce them? Where are you going to tell the stories of the dead? So that you have a sense of, it's not just existing here in this counseling conversation, right? It's not just existing in those places in the bereavement groups, but it's the places where the dead is going to travel with you, and who is going to help you do that, right? Who else loves them? Who else tells their stories, right? Now, and I want to swing back around to one other thing, then I'll take another break in a sec, if I know that I'm working with a family or a person where the relationship was really complex or worse, that using those questions around audience really matters, right? Because that's one of the places that I can look to decrease that voice of the person who was creating problems, who died, and I can increase the voices of the people who will travel with us, the audience, right? So I'm enlisting actually the Greek choir in that situation, right? I'm saying, who are all of the people, all of the voices that we can call forward and make them closer to you, the people who believe in you, the people who love you, the people who know about the amazing ways in which you live, right? How do we bring them closer? And then hopefully simultaneously work at diminishing the places where the stories of abuse have had tentacles. Okay. So in a nutshell, there's a very long theoretical background that we could go into about working in complicated relationships, but in a nutshell, that is one of the things I find helpful. Okay. All right. All right, so breaks. How's this going? Right. Let me come back. Renee, I see that you have a comment here in the chat about working with the experiences of dementia. And yes, I have used these ideas as well to inform those conversations. Since we are mutually informed that we are all relational beings, that other people hold my stories. It is not just me who holds my stories. So when somebody loses the ability in whatever way that happens to tell their own stories, I can ask other people to do that, right? It is a lovely use of working with a remembering conversation, right? That to talk about the experience of membership that we live in larger circles, right? And that our stories live in those circles. And so, yeah.
I think it's just so, it resonates so much with working with that type of group of people as well. And I'm also wondering, when we talk about complicated relationships, that sometimes relationships that perhaps weren't always so complicated, sometimes in situations where perhaps it has been a traumatic death. And I'm thinking of one person that I'm working with who lost her husband to suicide about 3 years ago. And now going to any family events is really hard, because it just is a reminder to her that others are moving forward, are happy in their lives, she's choosing to continue to isolate or not go, which is hard.
Yeah. It's so painful, right? And so in that process, right, her love for her partner is becoming more and more invisible, right? And then we have this overlay of what happens because the story of his death is further invisibilizing him, right? And so how is it that we can ask to reclaim the stories of his life? And is there one person who she can connect with in that circle that can be witness to that, right? Yeah, I feel for that, right? That experience. And it had the story of his death not become the predominant story. I think that there is also that experience where in time that people start saying, oh, it's been a little while, right? So we, it was good for a year that we could support and hear these stories. And now, it's been a year, so there's like this magical thing that happens. You've been through one anniversary of everything. So it's really time, to move on. And so the kinds of conversations that we start having shift at that point as people who consult with people who are living with grief, because we're talking about, how do you create some place of ongoing relationship for the long haul, right? Where the relationship gets to continue to have a space of visibility, right? And not give into those ideas that because you've been through 1 year of everything that you have to stop speaking or stop thinking or stop noticing, that the relationship continues to morph, right? And we know this like from our own lives is that at a year's point, we don't stop thinking about the person who died, right? We may have folded in many, many new memories in the meantime, right? But we're also then in a place where we get to invite them to be differently with us, right? Forever, right? That there is no reason why we have to stop thinking about them, talking about them, noticing their presence in our lives. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Other thoughts? We have just a few more minutes for a few more thoughts. I want just also looking. Yep. Here. Anything? Actually, can I shift the conversation? And maybe since we have about 10 minutes left, I'm wondering what it is that people might be cogitating on as the day goes today. You know, what is it that you're going to be thinking about as we step forward here? Yeah.
That's John here.
Hey, John. Tell me about the Vikings too. Who is? Oh, sorry, is that Glenn that had the Vikings? John, go ahead. Sorry, please.
I'll be brief.
No, please.
No, just reflect on what I've heard today. I never thought about the concept of love in the conversation before. Truly, yeah, I think that's what I'm going away with. Conversations and the approach, very common sense. It just struck me that you taught that it's all about separation and coping with separation, but actually this is almost cancelling out the separation, or at least putting it into the terms that the bereaved person can take forward successfully, refashioning that separation. So love was a great center around it. Thank you.
I cannot think of higher praise. I'm touched, right? Like it is that, right? Yeah, it is at the base of it, of everything love is, right? I have a lot of animals and a lot of people who've died in my life, and I love them dearly. And I hope to until the day I die, and maybe, who knows, maybe even after.
Lorraine, I think one of the things that I have thought about a lot, and I probably just have to email you sometime and ask you more about it, is that these ideas seem so much more widely applicable. Like, I think I heard a podcast episode that you did once, and you asked a bunch of beautiful questions about death, and I was like, I want to hear the answers to those now. And I had a conversation with my partner where we just asked each other your questions and got to hear about the history of our own relationship in a way that was really sustaining. And I recently was asked if I could run a grief group for people who've experienced breakups. I work in post-secondary. And I wonder, do you have any thoughts on the ways that you work with people who aren't dead? So because you talk about sort of ventriloquism and these ideas about where the person who has experienced the loss holds the voice of the person who is no longer alive. And I wonder if there's any sort of ethical differences or subtle differences if you were thinking about a relationship with someone who is alive but no longer present.
Yeah. There are major ethical things I'm thinking about with that. Yeah. So like people ask me sometimes, can we use these ideas in these different contexts? And there's some places where they're really fitting, like what we were talking about with dementia, right? Where people are holding the stories. There are other places where these ideas actually, I think, would produce not the best emotional experiences, like with breakups. Right. If we're talking about the re-inclusion and the restoration of relationship through a storied form, that may not actually be helpful when somebody is going through a separation, right? What we actually need sometimes is the opposite of that. So that we need some respite from the relationship, right? And so to say, the same kind of questions, what did you love about your ex? It might not be fitting, it may actually create more places of pain, right? Now there is kind of some ideas around, membership that and the reconfiguration of membership that I think blends over into talking about situations where somebody's going through a separation or a divorce, where we're looking at how do we pull those stories of identity and who has the right to speak on behalf of our identities, right? And so how we position that is very different. And oftentimes what we're doing when we separate from somebody is we are decreasing their authority to speak on our behalf, right? So we're maybe down the road, I might be telling the stories of what I love about them, right? I have not been enlightened enough in my life to do that at the time of a separation, that sometimes I need some space before I can see that more clearly. So yeah, there's places here where those ideas just don't fit. Now, what would fit is going back to what we were talking about the bubbles, about who's going to walk with you in this, right? Who's going to help you with those, creating those stories of new identity, right? And what are you taking from the relationship that will help form that, right? Yeah. People have asked me these questions like, just an odd, different thing somebody was asking me a long time is whether or not that they work with people who have lost limbs, and whether or not that we could use kind of remembering practices in that venue. And I struggle with that, right? That this is not a one size fits all model, which has been one of the things I've critiqued modern Greek psychology for, right? That I don't know where we would go with that with a lost limb, for example, what is it you miss most and what is it you love most about your leg? It doesn't work in that context. So that we need to be, I know that produces other places that create pain. So this is not a one size fits all model. It is really helpful, I think, for talking with people living with grief. It is exceptionally helpful for talking with people around dementia, around developing identities, right? And who holds the stories of that, right? But there are places where it would feel inappropriate to me. Yeah, good, okay. All right, so I see a couple of comments of things where how do we hold love and hope in the new identities emerging, right? I love that, right? That is always the focus, and that is the question, right? On how do we do that, right? How do we visibilize love, right? How do we feel it? How does it make our lives better? How is it that we would create something that is about creating new meaning, new purpose, right? Where we are having places to tell the stories of our dead loved ones. There's this beautiful thing I saw just really quickly on the news. How the news always has 25 minutes of horror and then 3 minutes but there's good news at the end, stories that at least as the US news model. I heard this beautiful story the other day in that 3 minutes at the end of the news broadcast about this fellow who started planting these milk thistle plants in his garden because they were attracting butterflies after his daughter died in a single car crash. And what he noticed was that all these butterflies came, and he had the sense of that she would really love that. And all of a sudden he realized he had all these seeds from these milk thistles. And so he started this movement where with a website saying, hey, if you want milk thistle seed plants, it's a hard phrase to say, I'll send them to you. And in sending them to people all over the world to plant, this was at the beginning of the pandemic shutdown, he sent a note about his daughter, right? That he was doing these things for her, right? And so he started at all these places where her story gets to be repopulated and replanted in other people's gardens, right? So she has taken on this new meaning, this new purpose, right? This young 16-year-old that died. And that's the visualization of love, right? Okay. All right, we're about out of time. Alex, how are we doing? This has been fun.
It's been such a meaningful conversation. Thank you so much. We have a couple minutes if there are any closing words from anyone or from you.
Hi, it's Glenn here again. If there's a moment, I'm just interested in the generation of dialogue in contrast to a propensity for monologue. I think that's just such a nice idea that you invite. And one of the things I've taken from reading your book is about inviting dialogue from the dead person, and that how that can be useful, really.
Yeah, the conversations don't stop, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah. Right. And like, I want to make them just public, not so private, right?
Well, that's what the Vikings did, I think.
Yeah. I was just going to say something that the Vikings did that. Yeah.
I'm not a Viking expert, and I'm advocating celebrating death, but they celebrated death by creating this space called Valhalla, and this is where I would go, and this is where I would meet my friends, my relatives, and it became a public thing and something to honor and celebrate.
Yeah.
And take with you into the future. And it's interesting how that discourse has left us now. And
yeah. All right. Well, I'm going to start channeling my inner Viking that I didn't know I had. So that's a really good thought, right? I put the website in the chat for folks too. There's articles there. There's other books, as well as the Bereavement Support Group book that I did with Taos. There's other resources. There's tons of articles. There's you can sign up for newsletters that pumps out some blogs when new things come up through the website, and you can also email me through there. So. So lovely. Alex, thank you for hosting and for Taos for supporting the ideas that I think are love inspired.
Thank you so much. We are so glad to have you here today, and thank you everyone for joining us. We have recorded this conversation, so it will be available on the Taos website within about a week. So feel free to review it or share it. And many thanks to all of you.
All right, go with love.